Hi everyone, my name's Andrew Harrop. I'm the General Secretary of the Fabian Society. It's a pleasure to be hosting this meeting jointly with FEPS, and this has been a joint project which we're launching today between the two think tanks. I just want to explain how the webinar technology works if you've not used it before. The things that we will be asking you to use is the question and answer function, which means that you can ask questions once we've heard from our speakers. So the way you do that is you type in questions into the question and answer box, and we'll be calling a selection of those that you ask. And to help us decide which ones to call, you can vote on the questions that other people on the call have already asked. So I really encourage you to vote on the ones you like, and then we'll know which are most popular, and we'll call those participants first of all. And then what we'll be able to do is to bring you into the call. Hopefully we'll be able to make the audio work so you can ask your question yourself. If for any reason it goes wrong, then we'll read out your question. And then we've also got a chat function, and that enables us to send some messages to you. So look out, first of all, we'll be sending a link to the new report that we've just published and various other links and bits of information about the project. I'm now delighted to hand over to Justin Norgard from FEPS, who's going to give you the background on this piece of work and the report we're publishing. Justin, over to you.
Thank you, Andrew. And welcome everyone. Indeed, I'm Justin Nogrede. I work for FEPS. I'm there the Digital Policy Advisor. And FEPS stands for the Foundation for European Progressive Studies, think tank based in Brussels, dedicated to stimulate progressive thinking at the European-wide level. I'm really thrilled to welcome you here for the book launch of our booklet called Public Service Futures, Welfare States in the Digital Age. Surprise, surprise, it's about the future of public services and our welfare state. We really asked a dozen of authors from different perspectives with different expertise to look into the future and to fit welfare states could and should evolve. We have a fair amount of contributors, of authors that take their cues from the UK experience, UK context. But of course, we also have a fair number of authors that really come from different European countries and that bring also the EU-wide perspective, which I think is also very relevant. Now, of course, I understand that the audience is mainly UK based. So you may think, okay, why do I care? Especially given the Brexit, perhaps. But I think that especially when we talk about public services, I think that's something that's relevant to each and every European country, whether you're inside the EU or outside. First, I think we have common goals. I think the ideal of the European social model is something that people care deeply about in the UK and elsewhere. I also think we have common challenges. And I think that's actually one of the main reasons why we commissioned this book. We have to think about aging societies. How can we organize care in those circumstances? How can we harness the impact, the new digital technologies that are out there? How can we harness them to really improve our services? How can we make sure that public services contribute to a carbon neutral state and sustainable services? And finally, of course, the rising inequality that I think we all experience across the EU, perhaps to a larger or smaller degree, depending on the country. So I think that makes it very relevant. And I also think that there's a lot that we can learn from each other. I know that the UK has an excellent tradition when it comes to competent and innovative civil service management. I think there's also a lot to be learned from other European countries at the Nordic model, but also at city level. I think of Barcelona and the way they handled digital technology to really empower citizens. So I think these are all very valid reasons for the broad perspective that we took. Of course, we didn't foresee the outbreak of the pandemic, the COVID crisis. But I think if anything, it really makes the work that we did more relevant. I don't know the situation in the UK, but here in Brussels, there's an unimaginable outpouring of support for public services. I would like to show you actually my street. I mean, I can't, but there's banners everywhere, slogans calling for more financing for public hospitals, support for healthcare workers, and so on. So I think this is really something that's in the public eye. Perhaps somewhat more sobering, I also think that the current crisis raises a lot of questions about how we deliver and how we conceive of our welfare state and our public services. For example, when we look at the response, I mean, I don't know how it is in the UK again, but here in Belgium and the Netherlands, I'm Dutch, there were a lot of warnings from healthcare professionals, from different local authorities, and we only acted at central government when it was inevitable and rather late, and we went to a full-scale lockdown, which of course now is inevitable, but was it in the grand scheme of things? More personal, actually, I had COVID-19 myself the past 2-3 weeks, and I was told to stay at home, take some paracetamol, and just ride it out, unless you couldn't breathe and you call the emergency services. And it also makes me wonder. I mean, there's no contact tracing, no testing, no mapping, nothing really. Can we do better? I think so. I mean, I'm the last person to suggest that, you know, an app can solve everything, but can technology solve anything? I think so. And I think if you read the book, you will find out that there's lots we can do. And that's why I really recommend you read it. It's more timely than ever. Finally, I would like to quickly introduce the 3 speakers that we have with us today and who will share their insights. First, we have with us Andrew Percy. He's co-director of the Social Prosperity Network at the Institute for Global Prosperity, and he wrote on universal basic services. Second, we have with us Emilia Smets. She's working on transport policy innovation at the University College London, and she's also involved in pan-European networks to really support sustainable transport at municipal level. And last but not least, we have with us Kit Collingwood. She's the digital and technology lead at the Royal Borough of Greenwich Council, and she has vast experience in digitizing public services for the past 10 years, I'd say. Of course, when we talk about public services and working in the public interest, I would really like to thank all the authors because they really did this pro bono. They dedicated their time, their knowledge to this project. So huge thanks. It's a bit awkward in an online meeting to applaud, but in person, I would have really loved to do so. So big thank you, and I hand over to Andrew. Thanks.
Thanks, Justin. And I should say we obviously couldn't have all 12 authors presenting in 1 hour, but some of them are on the call and I'll try and bring them in later. But I want to say that every chapter is fantastic. And we've really tonight, we're just giving you a flavor of some of what's in the book. Just to try and sort of sum up some of the key themes before we get into the detail with our 3 speakers. The starting point, even before the COVID crisis, is that Europe's welfare states do amazing things and serve people incredibly well, but they are in many places, in many ways, increasingly threadbare. In the UK context, we've seen a decade of austerity has really caused deep damage, and that's impacted on people's lives in all sorts of very visible ways, from street homelessness and food banks to older people not receiving the care they need, living standards falling, life expectancy stalling. So big challenges for the welfare state, even before the COVID crisis. Of course, Justin's just said our authors didn't know about the crisis when they wrote their chapters, but when you read the book, you'll be able to sort of, you know, between each line, sort of read for yourself the implications of what COVID-19 means for the things that people are saying. Almost every chapter is sort of, I feel the arguments are stronger because of what's happening now, rather than less relevant. One of the things that is talked about by many of the authors is that the sort of the specialness of public services and the public sector, how the ends, the goals, the mission of public service is different from the market, and sort of that the essential needs, as Andrew's chapter puts it, that public services are there to secure. And 2 of the chapters go on from that to talk about how the public sector and governments should have a human rights focus that will focus what the purpose of public services is in a better way. One of those chapters talks about the UK, the other about the EU, saying that social rights should sort of be, the underpinning of our public services. Those are sort of, if you like, that's the enduring way of thinking about what's the purpose and the mission of public service. But several of the chapters also talk about sort of, if you like, what are the emerging challenges that public services particularly going to have to focus on in the 2020s. And they talk about sort of like, if you like, the deficits that public services need to meet. So things like, sort of our health not being good enough, most relevantly, and gaps in care and support and family living standards, but also improving skills, investing in people's future, and of course the challenge of decarbonisation, which Amelia particularly spoke on in her chapter. The conclusion that several chapters draw in different ways is that the responsibilities and scope of the public realm, of public services, are going to have to expand in coming years, that we can't accept, if you like, the sort of the status quo in terms of what we expect governments and public services to do for us. Examples of that include zero carbon urban transportation, which Amelia will talk about, and affordable low energy housing, sort of to help that green transition, but also stronger, more universal care in old age and in childhood, lifelong learning really being there for everyone, because we'll need to keep on investing in skills and learning throughout our longer working lives, and access to essential digital technology. Again, the corona crisis and the confinement in our homes has demonstrated how technology is no longer an optional extra that the government can be indifferent on whether people have access to. That's all going to mean there will be huge upward spending pressures on public services. And the argument that several authors make is that even where there are right-wing governments in power, they're not going to be able to resist the growing demands for public services, partly driven by demographics, but also because of the expectations that public services do need to do more. But there's a risk that expansion in spending could be rather unplanned, chaotic, sort of reactive. And what needs to happen is that we have sensible prioritization about the big sort of challenges, so that it's planned and focused on investment in the future rather than just sort of meeting emergency needs now. And one of the authors makes a particular case for investing in capital infrastructure of welfare states rather than just, if you like, in salaries for workers. I'm not going to say anything more about the arguments around universal basic services, because Andrew will talk about that in a moment, but it's a big theme of his chapter, but also echoes across other chapters, how it's not just widening the scope of public services, but ensuring that their character is there for all of us, affordable, meeting essential needs. And then there are a series of contributions which are about, if you like, the changing way of delivering public services, talking about, if you like, the rolling back of outsourcing and privatization of public services, which, although still prevalent in many ways in different European welfare states, is becoming a little bit less common. Certainly in the UK, we're seeing a bit of a rowing back from it. But that's not the same as saying that government should deliver all public services. And there's a strong argument in various chapters, both for citizens to be directly involved in shaping and delivering their own services in some cases, but also for strong, independent, non-profit welfare institutions to remain involved in public services. So skepticism about the role of markets and privatization, but not necessarily the big state doing everything. So that's a lot of the themes of the report. The one thing I haven't yet touched on, where 3 chapters really focus, is the role of technology and innovation in changing the way that services are delivered. And Kit will talk about that in her contribution. But basically, there's a sort of a sense that technology really is going to come of age in the next decade in terms of transforming the experiences we have of our public services for the better. As Justin's just said, the corona crisis is, if you like, accelerating that. And that's partly going to be about better experiences of our, transactions with public services of one sort or another. But it's also about invisible public service delivery, so that the state and welfare institutions can do things for us without us even needing to be involved, like good data management, data sharing, data profiling. But of course, to use our data well, the public sector has to be trusted with our data. And several authors talk about the importance of trust and convincing people that the public services can use our private information very well. And if they fail to do that, they won't be able to make the progress in innovation, and the possibilities won't come true. So it is a really challenging context because of the crisis we're in now, because of the state of the economy that we can expect in the next few years, because the pressures and demands are so high. But there's also a huge amount of potential and opportunity in the development of public services over the next few years. And I think, we need to focus on the upsides, the potential, as well as being mindful of what could go wrong. If there's enough money, if there's permission to innovate, and if citizens are involved in shaping the direction of public services, I think we can be really positive that the public realm will be stronger in 2030 than it is today. Justin, back to you.
Thank you, Andrew. And I suggest to go right into the presentations by the different authors. Just one quick thing before, there's ample time for Q&A afterwards. So to the audience, if you have a question, there's a Q&A box on your screen where you can ask your question, and we'll get back to you afterwards. So think of a question already and put it in the system. So let's start with Andrew Percy. Andrew, you wrote a chapter about universal basic services. Could you explain us why we need them?
Sure, put myself off mute there. Good evening, everybody, and thank you to the Fabian Society for inviting us, A, to participate in the book, and B, to come along tonight. So Anna Koot and I wrote this article for this. We also have a book out called The Case for Universal Basic Services this year on polity. The principle here is to try and provide a centralized idea and rallying point for public services generally. And we take as a premise that in Europe, we're lucky enough to have got whatever the infrastructure and institutions that were built after World War II into what we would call our welfare states today, which are mostly focused around healthcare, education, and to a certain extent, perhaps housing. And what in this proposal for universal basic services, what we ask people to do is to grow, expand that idea, widen the horizon. In the introduction there, you said, well, we're looking into the future of public services. I hope not too far into the future. Including in that, then we would add in additional services. Primarily, we're talking about information and digital, expanding the care services beyond healthcare, including transport, and paying attention to how this is delivered in a much more modern way, as you said, not with, as Andrew was saying, not that just taking this idea of some sort of centralized state that is the primary provider. I think one of the things that Anna and I have found as we've gone through each of these service areas is to recognize that when we talk about public services generally, or universal basic services generally, we also need to pay attention to the fact that in each of these areas, the delivery model is going to be a little different. The requirements of that area are unique and need looking at that are specific to that, that service area. The premise that the sort of argument we make to build up for universal basic service consists of three primary parts. One is that there are a set of shared needs that we all have, and that these can be differentiated from what people want, and that we should be using needs as a way of focusing our attention. That we can look at some of those and see them as things that we cannot solve for ourselves individually, that we will have to tackle these kinds of needs as a collective responsibility and do them together. And that in doing all of these, sort of making this progress, that we have always got an eye towards the sustainability. From a climate perspective, but also from a fiscal perspective, which is maybe something we'll come on to talk about more because of the pressures from the response to the COVID crisis, and from a social perspective, that we should be moving to something that we really feel that we can be comfortable in and that we can carry on for some time. we make various arguments to do with equity, the efficiency of services, their ability to engender solidarity, as well as the sustainability alignment. I think that the efficiency piece is probably going to get even more attention as we go into this next phase, because everyone's going to be having to probably look at higher taxes for a variety of other reasons apart from just expanding the public state. But I think that one thing that we would note is that the last time we were in this kind of position fiscally was after World War II, and that was the deal coming out of that was that we built the early welfare states. And so this idea that part of going forward from here is going to be a quid pro quo, that we might be sacrificing certain things, we might be paying a bit more taxes, but there's got to be an offer in place that says that we are basically going to improve livelihoods, we're going to improve the quality of life, and we would make a strong argument that the way to do that is through public services. I will say one thing, having read the book and through the other essays in this, is that there is a lovely alignment across all of these contributions in this book. Whether we're talking about, I know Amelia's going to talk in a bit about positioning for climate crisis, building social infrastructure. Harry talks about a social deficit. These are all ideas that we would see as being, part and parcel of universal basic services. And I would just then reiterate the last piece that I'd like to make sure that people take on board here is that we don't want this to be seen or perceived as a centralized state taking a solution and pushing it down. This has to involve local design. The role for the state, as Anna and I see it, is primarily in defining rights to access to basic services, collecting the money that is necessary and efficiently collected at a national level, and then distributing that money through local democracies to appropriate providers that might be cooperatives or collectives or commons-based organizations that would actually deliver the service in a way that is sensitive to the local area, so that it's designed and delivered in a way that makes sense of that. And I think that I'll stop there and say that's probably enough of an introduction for universal basic services. I look forward to answering some questions as they come up.
Thank you, Andrew. Perhaps just a very quick follow-up. Of course, now there's a big debate. I know in the UK about and about the fact that it becomes very obvious that indeed our welfare state and our public services are far from universal, and so a lot of people actually fall through the cracks. Mm-hmm. Do you think that the crisis will actually accelerate the ideas that you talk about being implemented? Do you think that we'll get there faster?
I think it's quite a critical juncture and probably quite a difficult time. So I certainly don't think that it is, we can assume that will be the case. It seems obvious, I think, from a certain perspective to say the gaps in our response to this crisis demonstrate the fabric of our society and where it has been weakened. But I feel like we are going to have to make the argument to expand public services, to put resources into the development of collective capabilities and capacity. And that there will be, we should expect that there will be a reaction in a different direction that says we can't afford any of that anymore. We've blown it, we went overdrawn. Now is not the time to spend money on doing any of that stuff. In fact, we've got to cut back. So while it may seem obvious on one level that it is the weakness in our social fabric that has meant that our ability to respond to this crisis has been sort of much more emergency based, and the response then quite often the only way to help people is to sort of throw money at the problem, because we don't have the infrastructure, and you can't build that infrastructure in the timescale of a crisis. we should also take on board that this is an argument we have to make, and I think we have to win in the public space, because it's not, I think it's 50-50.
All right, very well said, and I couldn't agree more, really. I mean, you raised the issue of infrastructure, so perhaps it's good to move to Emilia, who wrote a chapter about the carbon neutral state, which of course involves the question of infrastructure as well. How do we deliver mobility, public transport? Could you perhaps share your views? How do we get there?
Thanks, Justin. It's really great to be here. The book looks fantastic, so it's a fun chapter to write. The brief that I was given was to write about how to achieve a carbon neutral state, and I focus mainly on transport as was described, because that's my area of expertise. But I'm broadly interested in the role of local government, as Andrew alluded to, in all of this. So I like Andrew Harrop's framing in the introduction, actually, of my chapter, which kind of puts it in the frame of decarbonisation is about achieving, expanding the state, kind of stepping up to provide new kinds of public goods. And I think that was mentioned by Andrew as well. So I think this idea of the welfare state, we always focus on health, education and social services as our core services, and while those are incredibly important, there's a lot of links to infrastructure there, and I think the delivery of physical infrastructure needs to be better integrated into our idea of the welfare state. So before the pandemic hit, climate change was really at the top of the agenda. In 2019, the European Union released a European Green Deal, and the UK government also released a net zero emission target by 2050, which means that we should be climate neutral in the UK by 2050. And there's been a lot of mobilization from local governments across Europe as well, with a lot of municipalities declaring climate emergencies and so on. We'll get on to how COVID affects all of this later, but in the EU, energy consumption, around 25% of it is from transport, and that's similar in the UK. So we also have an urban population, and so decarbonisation is quite a big chunk of it is about decarbonising transport in urban areas overall. It was interesting to think about the link between the welfare state and something like transport. It's not perhaps particularly intuitive, but the truth is that delivery of public services requires a lot of movement of goods and people, and obviously citizens need to be able to access those services through travelling using different forms of transport as well. That's why the NHS released recently a Greener NHS campaign, which sets a net zero target for the NHS, and actually estimates that the NHS accounts for around 4 to 5% of the carbon footprint of the UK. Then when we started thinking about how to decarbonise health services, for example, one key issue would be where we locate healthcare facilities and how easy it is for people to access them, and how we trade off that decision between consolidating healthcare services in larger facilities on the edges of urban settlements, for example. And the second aspect, of course, is that transport is a public service in itself. At least in the UK, for example, bus services are widely considered to be a public service, but they're not really delivered in the public interest at the moment. Rather, they're delivered for commercial profit. So I think there's a lot to think about how the state in the UK can step up to deliver better public transport. And obviously there are strong links between the car-dominated society we have now and well-being and social equity, because already in the mid-2000s, the New Labour government's social exclusion unit really proved that social exclusion is deeply linked to the kind of travel opportunities and transport services that people have access to. So I make three key arguments in my chapter. The first is that we need to really break the link between the welfare state and the car. In the post-war period, car industries, large car companies were really integral to economic growth in a lot of European countries. And I think we really need to reimagine the welfare state without the car in it, rather than focusing, as very many politicians still tend to do, on propping up the car industry. So I think there needs to be similar thinking in relation to coal, and reskilling people, phasing out those industries. I think we need that for car industries as well. The second point is that I think national governments do need to step up and provide really attractive visions for the future. And we've seen this in the Green New Deals. And crucial to those is, of course, that we need the state to commit sufficient levels of public spending to match the scale of the challenge. You know, in the post-war period, there were extraordinary amounts of money spent on all the highways, all the car-dependent infrastructure we have now, all across Europe, linking countries, and in the US and the UK. And that was really some of the largest public spending we've seen in history. So to really think about how we're going to transition away from that, we need to think on that scale in what kind of new public transport services we can provide. Now, I do agree with Andrew that in relation to the Green New Deal visions, or other visions that have come up lately, they tend to be quite top down and sort of evoking this idea of the state at war and so on. And I think there needs to be a clear mandate in there for local government and the involvement of local communities. So I'm very much in agreement with that. And the final point to finish is that I think we really need to think about how we can more meaningfully empower local government. So obviously local autonomy and fiscal decentralization varies a lot across Europe. So the comparative figure would be 4.2% in the UK in terms of local tax revenue to 32.2% in Sweden, for example. So I think we really need to, in the UK, to get to grips with how centralized our state is. And, you know, local government is expected to deliver a lot of the decarbonisation of a lot of services, but of course that capacity has been decimated by austerity and the legacy of privatisation of bus services and other transport services we have in this country from the Thatcher period. So we're really in quite a dire state when it comes to public transport services at the moment, when we need to be able to go in the opposite direction. So just to finish that, I think the new next Labour government really needs to incorporate all of these decentralisation ideas into any kind of new Green New Deal proposal. And I think that came through a little bit, but not enough, because among researchers on transport and urban planning and so on, the new Labour is most criticised for really not taking this decentralisation agenda far enough, and you know, sort of going more down the new public management route in those areas. So I think really meaningful decentralization will be important. Thanks.
Thanks a lot, Emilia, for highlighting how, and this is perhaps unusual for us to think about normally, but how relevant the question of infrastructure and mobility is for the conception of our welfare state and how that impacts people. And also to really look forward to how we can change that, actually, or dependence on the car, for example. There's actually a lot of questions I have also related to, you know, the fact that there was a lot of momentum for the Green Deal in 2019. How does it look now? But we're a little bit behind schedule. So I suggest, and I'm sure this will come up also in the Q&A with the audience, to move on to Kit and to talk a bit about public services and digital technology. Because Kit, you wrote a chapter about how we can use and harness digital technologies to actually deliver better, more emphatic, more interactive and more tailored public services. Again, like my COVID experience was a bit different, but I think the necessity is definitely there. So perhaps you can share your experience and your vision for how we bring that about.
Thank you. I should say by way of introduction, I am currently, as was mentioned, the Chief Digital Officer at Royal Greenwich Council. I previously worked in the justice system, and then I also worked for the Department for Work and Pensions, where I led on data for universal credit. So this subject matter is close to my heart from several angles. My chapter is about the role of digital technology in government in the future. It was more than anything a rhetoric of hope, albeit tinged with a lot of experience. I would say I actually feel even more hopeful now, based on what I've observed within local government over the last 6 weeks. But it's fair to say that my perspective on all of this has shifted. So rather than talk directly about the chapter, I'm just going to bring out 3 themes of that chapter, which have shifted for me over the last 6 weeks, having led a technology team trying to radically shift what it's doing in a crisis. The first thing I'll mention is the ability of technology to build cohesion and community in a crisis. That was not deliberate alliteration, by the way. To take a very mundane case in point, and all my best case studies are incredibly mundane, using video calling among our social work community here in Greenwich to assess at-risk children virtually has been a new skill, a new service, something that has been spun up in a matter of days under an atmosphere of necessity, very dark necessity, to assess the risk factors involving children when you can't see them. And it brings one of the points I made in the chapter to light, which is when you wield technology in deeply personal and deeply local ways, it can really work magic. And it's something that I'm hoping to bring out far more as the crisis, the current crisis wanes a little bit and we're able to pick up the pieces and amplify the things that have gone well. So there's definitely one point which I made in the chapter which has been amplified for me, is this ability for technology to not be, a faceless tool, but be something deeply personal. And the second theme I would pull out that I've also observed over the last few weeks is the genesis of real data-driven decision-making. And there's nothing like a life and death situation to focus people's minds. And the example that comes to my mind is the sharing of NHS data to local authorities at pace. And I'm never going to forget the pace at which we've worked in this last few weeks. And again, it's something that I'm hoping to sustain afterwards. But the joining of local to central government through the sharing of data, the transparency that's brought, the need for human beings to speak to each other, and to devise on the fly new approaches to sharing, which balance the people who need to be on the receiving end of services, so identifying the most vulnerable, with the need to share privacy, and the common mission that's happened between central and local government. That's not something that's easily forgotten, and I hope it's not something that we'll easily row back on. And what I can see as a trend for the future is sort of a radically more empowered local government sector. We've certainly seen over the last few weeks that we are far more in demand from central government colleagues than we've ever been before. And having been on both sides of that fence, it's extremely different to me than anything I've ever experienced. So this local and central join up to serve people who who are vulnerable in some way and have acute need is something which I hope will be cemented over the next few years. And thirdly, and linked to those two, is what I would say, I hope it's not too glib to say a move from digital by default to equitable by default is certainly something that I've observed. The rhetoric in central government digital transformation of the last decade or so that I've been involved in it is that we build for the many, and people with acute vulnerable need were known as edge cases, which is cold language. And we always knew it was cold, and it shifted slightly over the last few years, but nothing like the way it shifted in the last few weeks. So a focus on the most vulnerable, not the least vulnerable, the centering of minority groups through technology, the serving of the people who need your services most first, as opposed to those who need them last, which is what we saw previously, even to the use of volunteers and the bringing together of different sectors to serve those vulnerable people. There's something very humbling about it. If you consider the relaxing of certain conditionality measures in universal credit over the last few weeks, even what's been seen by many as a bastion of fill in your own word here, it's not a universally popular service, but even that, we've started to see the crumbling away of certain elements of that, and I hope that those accelerate over the coming months. I'm slightly over time, so I'll wrap up there, but they're the 3 things which have shifted my perspective on my previous comments. So the radical localization, joining of central to local government and transparency of data, and equity.
Thanks a lot, Kit. And that's really a hopeful story, which I think is very necessary, and also something that, yeah, it's not always obvious. I also worked in public service before. The fact that, you know, you have emphatic services, equitable services, and digital technology. The marriage is not always, it's not always obvious, unfortunately, but the potential is there. I have also here I have some follow-up questions actually linked to COVID, but actually I see that in the Q&A box there's already a lot of questions also linked to digital. So I guess it's much more interesting to hear from the audience than from me in terms of collective intelligence. So I suggest that I give the floor to Andrew and that we ease into the Q&A session. Thanks a lot for your intervention, Kit.
Thanks, Justin, and 3 fascinating contributions. And we've got some of our other authors on the call, as I said, and actually 2 of them have been given the most top-rated questions. So I can bring in, I'm going to bring in Nadira Hussain and then David Walker, who you have voted to be able to ask their questions because of the popularity contest we've got running. But I'd like them each to also just say a word about their own chapter at the same time. So Nadira, first of all, could you both ask your question, but also say a word about the work you wrote? Hi, Nadira, can you hear me? This is what happens sometimes with this kit. Occasionally you think it's going to work and it doesn't. Nadira, can you hear?
Yes, I can.
Yeah, go ahead.
Okay, so in terms of the question first then, Andrew, what we're hoping to use is the word reset rather than, you know, the possible language that may be used about reverting back to where we were pre kind of COVID-19. So how are we going to use the opportunities that we're now seeing to reset our models of public service delivery for future rather than, you know, reverting to how things have been previously? So that's the question. How do you want to do this, Andrew? Do we want to have a little bit of a discussion about that question in particular, or do we want to move to...
I'm trying to cover a lot of ground all in one go. Just try and give a 30-second flavour of what you wrote in the chapter. I know that's a very hard ask.
It absolutely is, but I'm just going to build on some of the points that Kit has helpfully articulated. I think absolutely spot on and very much a link to the question as well, actually. But if we are going to, you know, kind of revolutionize the relationship between citizens and public services and be innovative in terms of the use of our technologies, then it is very much about, you know, getting that messaging right, getting the engagement right, using empathetic and intelligible language. It's very much about making connections and putting, you know, the engagement at the heart of the communication. But it's also about that kind of spin of co-creation, co-design of public services rather than us imagining what those services need to look like. We're very much looking at the left shift of intervention. So how can we absolutely kind of focus on the health and well-being of our citizens rather than focus on that kind of expensive, acute delivery of services on the other end. And finally, really, it's about, you know, kind of people-centric approach to service delivery and ensuring that we are looking at the place-based provision of services to focus on cohesive health and well-being of our communities.
Brilliant, and thanks, Nadira. And I do think that Kit, Nadira, and Justin's chapters really do read very well as a 3 with overlaps, but some, you know, bits of difference as well. But it really, all 3 very interesting on how technology and innovation is changing, if you like, the sort of fabric of public service rather than just being, you know, sort of an add-on that perhaps it was once thought of. And now I want to bring in David Walker, and then I'll go back to the panelists. Is David still on the call? I think he might have disappeared off it. I'm sorry about that. So I will change plan. No, David, I'm going to read out David's question. So David asked, this conversation is assuming that all local governments are progressive, and they aren't. Do you allow local choice not to provide or not to make green transition, whatever the context might be, given that in England, most local government is dominated by Conservatives? And I think that's relevant partly from the digital perspective, but also for Andrew and Amelia as well. So let me go back to the panelists to reflect on that question as well as Nadira's very briefly, if you can, so we can get some more questions in. Let me start with Amelia.
Thanks. Yeah, that's a very, very good question. I think in research, we tend to try to focus on the more positive, hopeful stories. Well, I think it needs to be a balance. So it's true, I guess, in the UK, if we look at our city regions, especially, we've got kind of a red core and a blue belt around it. I mean, local governments do need capacity to deliver on things. There's no point in having any kind of central government policy or expecting local government to decarbonise if they're simply unable to deliver, to pay, you know, regular staff. But I think there needs to be something, a combination of that empowerment and top-down, ensuring that the public interest is protected. So I think air quality standards and air quality legislation is a very good example of that, where we do, you know, require local government to protect people's health. And the other example would be ensuring that we have governance structures in place where suburban suburban towns are required to cooperate to some extent on public transport with an inner city area that to provide public services to safeguard people's transport services. Shall I answer the other question as well?
Is this a reset moment, or can it be a reset moment?
Okay, I think definitely in terms of urban transport or mobility. I mean, I think first of all, this whole crisis has shown that mobility is really fundamental to the functioning of our society, and it's shown all the inequalities that exist in people's opportunities and choices they have available. There's a few different opportunities. One is obviously that we've realized that there's a lot of space that we actually like using in our cities when they don't have cars. We've realized that there's lots less pollution, and that's linked to COVID as well in terms of the impacts of that on our health. But in terms of really resetting and kind of bouncing forward, I think the key term that people are now using is build back better, which is essentially using this pandemic and the stimulus, that spending that's going to be needed to actually use that stimulus for sustainable infrastructure.
Kit, can I ask you to reflect? I mean, you gave some brilliant examples of how change is happening now, but how are you going to sort of push that forward to make sure that, you know, sort of whatever the new normal is, you know, captures some of that innovation? And also, if you could respond to David's question about local government that isn't so engaged and progressive.
Yeah. So if I do the last one first, the question is, should there be local choice about not implementing some of these changes? My blithe answer is no. There are some things which should be supra political and are to do with basic human rights. Sadly, there's not really any such thing as supra political. But I do think that there are service patterns and service design principles that you can use nationally, which can be implemented locally, and where the sell can be quite simple. The sell can be often from central government. You can implement this for free, we can share this with you, and you can implement it without too much friction, which can overcome some of the false arguments about finances, which often are the case with local governments of a different shade. To answer the first question, how you make this the new normal, we're trying to be incredibly pragmatic about that in how we're going about it. And the first step is simply writing it down. What qualitatively and quantitatively, what is it about this crisis that has been good? Because it's not good, it's a crisis and a lot of people have died. If we strip all that away, what can we salvage from the wreckage of what's happened? And try and sort of, without being incredibly cheesy, do a bit of honour to what's happened to the country and get something good out of it. So what we're doing is writing down the good. And we're doing it across local government communities at the moment. And it's everything from, the things I've said, if this ever happens again, we'll never be stuck without the technology we need for people to do their jobs. And it's that community cohesion. It's having links to central government departments who can empower us to do things locally. It's you know, harnessing the power of the local community to volunteer to help the most vulnerable. It's all of those beautiful green shoots and the kind of dark magic that's been done over the last few weeks, and using that progress as a ratchet, not a slide. You know, put a marker in the sand, describe the change that you want to make, and hopefully in, you know, expressing it in words, it won't slide back so much. Sorry, that I'm sorry, I feel like I'm sounding very abstract, but that's how I work very visually, and that's how I can visualize it, is by writing it down and describing it in open words so that it's undeniable to those who have to agree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, no, absolutely. Andrew, do you want to sort of like, again, comment on that reset question in terms of, does this move forward universal public services as you see them, and also how do you implement your vision everywhere if there are all sorts of different local governments who need to be part of what you want to see happen?
Right. So on the first one, the reset and how, you know, making practical progress from here, there are, I think, two different parts. The most accessible thing is that there are a number of services, of which transport would be a big one, but also digital access, what we would call the information service, where that infrastructure exists already. And it is simply a matter of sort of change the rules and the pricing to make sure that it's universally accessible. So I think that's the place you make early and rapid progress, is that you could, for instance, just say, okay, you know what, when we come back on this, and you know, transport, funnily enough, is one of the tricky ones in this particular crisis, right? Because public transport isn't equated well with a lot of social distancing. But assuming we get past this at some point, I think, you know, shared resource public transport is the way to go in a lot of urban areas. That either eliminating or reducing the price does not require new infrastructure to go into place. We have a transport system. In some places, we do need new infrastructure. But anyway, generally enabling better access and greater access to the services which we are already delivering is the first general step to go in the direction of. We talk in our chapter about widening them, and we would like to widen them. But there's sort of two elements to that, right? Which is, you know, can you just give people access to things, and then can we expand those services so that they are better and broader? And that, I think, goes straight into this local question, which is, you know, this is going to happen because of a national initiative. And I think, Andrew, you've talked about the you know, one of the things that we need to pay attention to coming out of this is that there's going to have to be a political coalition around this kind of activity. And if we assume, first of all, that there has to be a coalition at a sort of national level, partly because you need to raise some of the revenues, and that's tax issue is certainly in the UK, but in many other places is primarily at the national level. Were you to then make that coalition happen, you can perfectly well attach a condition to the money as you pass it down to the local government, and establish, as what Anna and I have said, one of the primary roles for a national or federal organization government would be to establish basic entitlements. So that it's not, if you then have a local government that's not inclined to do that, we do this throughout our society. We have sets of rules of law that are, you know, nationally defined, and local governments don't get the option to revise those. They get the option to have maybe minor tweaks of local initiatives about how people behave in certain ways, but we don't. There are basic standards that we establish, promote, and insist on as a national standard. And I think that, therefore, if we look at the reform process, it's a political coalition that's mated to some tax changes. Along with that revenue comes a commitment that at least the following minimum should be provided. And that's how we roll that through.
Great, thanks, Andrew. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to take two more questions from participants, and then I'm also going to bring in two of the other authors, and that's Koldo and Simon, if they want to prepare themselves. But first of all, I'm going to ask Norman Rimmell to ask his question. Norman, can you speak?
Can you hear me?
Yes, I can. Go ahead.
Yeah. Right, yeah. Hello. Well, it seems to me that one of the public services that have been most deeply infected by the coronavirus crisis has been education. I mean, most children are now taught at home through the internet, and schools and teachers have had to learn to communicate with parents in ways in which they've probably never done before. And it's always been realized that home and school cooperation is central to the education process, but a lot of this has been mere talk in the past. Very little has been done about it. But now we have a real situation where it has to happen. Education at the moment can only take place if parents are communicating with schools and vice versa. So I think we have enormous amount to learn from what is going on at the moment that can be useful in the future when the present crisis is over. I wondered if the speakers would agree with this idea or what they would like to say about it.
Great, thanks. And now I'm going to ask Alistair Cryan if he'd like to ask his question. Hi, Alistair, are you there? Hi, Alistair. No, something's not working with that one. I'm going to read it out. So Alistair says, I'm not a Luddite with regards to digitalization, but one of the main questions that advisors have had in grappling with universal credit is that it has not been addressed how the government envisages claimants who do not have access to the internet or who have very low literacy can access the benefits which they're required to do using the internet or with a high degree of literacy. So we'll ask, I might fire that at Kit, particularly because she used to work on universal credit, but it's a wider issue about all sorts of access to digital platforms for people who really do struggle, even if more and more of us are very comfortable with digital systems. And then I'm going to also bring in Simon Kaye, who's one of the authors. Hi, Simon. Can you just tell us for 30 seconds a little bit about your chapter?
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Brilliant. Yeah, thanks for the opportunity. Yes, the chapter I wrote, I think, lined up really nicely with a lot of the other stuff we've heard tonight and other bits of the book. It's almost as if some clever plan was constructed and good editing took place to ensure that all of these different elements agreed with each other and built a shared tapestry. So thanks for doing that. I think that was the key thing here, was good editing. But I've really enjoyed looking through the book as well. The key point that I'd like to drive home here is that it's not just a matter of thinking about the way that people interact with their public services and the way they're delivered, but it's also about thinking about the nature of those services too, as some people have already said this evening. Some services deserve to change quite radically, and that involves involving people at a community level in a rather radical way in some cases too. Interventions need to be earlier. The contributions of different services need to be joined up and efficiencies need to be found if we're going to address the kind of spiraling demand that we're encountering, and particularly in the aftermath of this really strange pandemic experience as well. So you can add my voice to everyone else who's saying we need to embed some of the extraordinary things that are happening under the most difficult of conditions right now. But one of the things that really does need to be brought into sharp focus is that it's not just a matter of how we think about and deliver public services, but the way that those services are conceived themselves.
Great, thank you. And then Calder, if you're still on the call, I'd love to hear for 30 seconds or so about your chapter, which was making the case for human rights being embedded in how we think about public services.
Hi Andrew, a pleasure to be here and a pleasure to contribute to the publication. Yeah, my chapter basically makes 3 points. The first point is that the UK has the Human Rights Act since 1998, and the Human Rights Act is very important. We need to cherish it, we need to preserve it, and we need to defend it against anyone that threatens with repealing it. And the current government, probably after COVID-19, will probably try to execute the threats to repeal it or to derogate from the European Convention, and we should resist that. However, and this is the second point, the Human Rights Act is not enough to preserve all our human rights in the UK, because by and large, socio-economic rights are not included in the Human Rights Act. So issues like the right to social security, the right to health, the right to housing, are not recognized as such in UK's law and policy. So I made the case to enhance the status of socioeconomic rights in UK's law and policy. And I give 4 examples in which, for policy, concrete policy examples, where that will make a difference in relation to rental evictions, in relation to access to healthcare for undocumented migrants, in relation to access to work, in relation to sanctions and social security entitlements, and the details are in the chapter. The third argument, though, is that taking socioeconomic rights seriously would of course require new policies, but it would also require taking policies differently and adopting new processes in which we take on board the opinions and the views of people who are struggling the most, who are at greater harm of risk and disadvantage, and people with lived experience of poverty are listened more carefully when we, as society, design policies and implement policies that affect them the most. Thank you.
Thanks, Koldo. So you're really getting a flavour of the range of contributions we've had in the book, and I hope you'll read all of them in your own time after the meeting. So I'm just going to ask our 3 speakers if they'd like to reflect on those questions, particularly the question on what this means for education and about digital exclusion, and also just make some closing reflections on the meeting as a whole. So let me start by asking Amelia to do that. Hi, Amelia.
Sorry.
There you go.
I was on mute there. Yeah, I'll answer the one about digital services. So yeah, there's been a digitalization of transport mobility services as well over the past, say, decade or 5 years. I mean, one issue is access to smartphones, for example, since a lot of services and information is provided via smartphone these days. However, I think the more significant issue is I was just reflecting on kind of kids' work and other works that's being mentioned here today about co-design of services. And I think this is really much more advanced when we're talking about health, education, social services compared to areas of infrastructure policy like transport or housing or even planning. So we really don't see equally sophisticated models, I think. And when it comes to local planning, I mean, there's kind of the gulf between, you know, community hall meetings at sort of 6 p.m. in the afternoon, where a very select group of people go to influence what's happening in their community, and then sophisticated digital tools, which a lot of people don't necessarily have access to. So I think that would be the main area from my point of view that we need to think about. Just to conclude, that I've really loved the focus on rights, human rights, basic rights, the public interest during the event, and I think that's the main thing that I'll be taking forward into my own thinking. Thank you.
Thanks, Amelia. Andrew, would you like to answer the questions and make your own concluding remarks?
I think the main thing that I would say is it's what jumps out to me from those questions, and particularly the ones you know, about the integration of about education and what have we learned, or access to these services, is that, and I think this is why Anna and I are quite keen on this sort of overarching narrative around it, and I know you are too, Andrew, whether we call it public services or public safety or universal basic services, because they interact with each other. And the efficiency of these doesn't come out of the standalone analysis of transport. It's the integration with transport and technology and information access that gives you a mobility service. It's the connection between technology and care and the healthcare system that's going to be the answer for a bit much better and more effective social care as we go forward. So I think that the questions are absolutely right to point out that these connections do exist, and I think that we can only support that and say that yes, it's to get full value out of a public service infrastructure, we need to broaden our idea of what's included, and really start to make sure that we're always talking about putting digital in, putting transport in, and understanding it's the devolution through local design, and that those are the keys as we go forward.
Great. And just before I hand over to Kit, I'll just say goodbye from me, and Justin's going to close the meeting after Kit's made her final remarks. Kit.
Thanks. I'll make a comment on one of the questions that you asked me too, which was from Alistair. How does government envisage claimants getting access to benefits? Well, the original rhetoric around digital by default in government was simply, most people use the internet, therefore I'm sure everything will be fine. And when that was found lacking, we moved to a sort of multi-channel, you can do it online by default, but, we'll give you a call center if you're lucky. The rhetoric has matured since then, and we now do have, what's laughingly called omni-channel. Basically, you can use the services you need to. But in my view, there are some fundamental truths about service delivery to the most vulnerable, which is you must design your service as if everybody's in a period of crisis. And in a period of crisis, people are cognitively impaired, and you need to make the service appropriate to their needs, which is sometimes you can do it on a smartphone and that's fine. But the vast majority of the time, people need additional help, and public services have to be funded to deal with that truth, or that money and that need will get pushed elsewhere, and that person will get less and less empowered, not more and more. That's one of the truisms. And then I would say the second one is that the more you think about digital as a channel and not as a tool to foster human communication and to reach an outcome, the more it will be true that the people who are already doing absolutely fine will get finer, and the people who aren't doing fine will get worse off. And that sounds like a bit of a sour note, and it's absolutely not. But my point is we need to radically shift the rhetoric about what we mean by digital in government, because from my point of view, the debate has still not been had in full. Final comments in general. Thank you so much for your invitation to this. This has been fascinating from my point of view, not as a contributor, but as somebody listening to all of this stuff. And it's really fascinating to hear the join up between everything we're saying. We're all talking about equity. We're talking about these hybrid approaches. There's no one absolute. We're talking about what you get from a crisis and how you go forward with it. So this for me personally has been a really hopeful session, and I hope others feel the same. Thanks.
Thank you, Kit.
Thanks a lot, Kit. And I fully agree. I've actually not a lot to add to that, but just need to reiterate again that I feel there's a lot of commonalities in the themes we discussed, and also the solutions we propose. So kind of like a broad framework, perhaps at national level, of guaranteed rights and public services. And of course, a lot of leeway for the local level for communities to actually design those actual services and to deliver them. Of course, whether or not that will happen in the coming time, whether everybody agrees with, those in power agree to actually carry out such an agenda, is very much up for grabs. It's very much in the balance. Of course, I don't want to say here that, the crisis is an opportunity. It's first and foremost a crisis, but crises do tend to accelerate social change. But only if we make the case. And I think, as Andrew already said in the beginning, it's for us to really make the argument. We do so in the book. So please go have a look and read on the FAPS website, on the Fabian's website. I'll also now share again the FAPS link. And again, thanks a lot for listening. Thanks a lot for your questions, for commenting. And till we meet again. Thank you. Thank you. Big thanks to the panelists that really shared their thoughts and the contributions today. Thank you.
Thank you.
Have a nice evening. Stay safe. Stay sane. Bye-bye.